Okay, hello, Khaleem Ali. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Um, can you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Khaleem Ali. I am from Trinidad and Tobago. 26 years old and an attorney at law by profession, but a human rights defender and foresight expert by passion.
Right. What does that mean? What is a foresight expert?
A foresight expert is someone who works within the realm of futures literacy and future studies, which is basically just mapping existing trends and looking at the potential for existing trends to snowball into future implications or future problems and trying to plan for those alternative realities and mitigate them. So it really is just about having a vision that focuses on foresight. What's next? And what are all the possibility next that could occur? And how do we
Right.
plan or adjust for them?
So, do you have a crystal ball?
Yes, we all have a crystal ball in our mind.
Right.
Yeah, but no, we have, I think if you wanted to call it a crystal ball, we have data that is
Mm.
available to us. That is the crystal ball. That is what we use to, map and identify trends. We
Yeah.
use both quantitative and qualitative data, and we kind of use that to get a sense of where's the world currently and where's the future heading.
Yeah.
So as opposed to saying like, something as broad as what would Trinidad and Tobago's economy look like in 15 years, you would say, what are the possible areas for expansion of Trinidad and Tobago's economy in the next how much ever years, or the possible areas for contraction of the economy. And so you kind of like take more narrow or focused areas and you develop you look at trends to develop patterns. And from those patterns, you could say, okay, well, this is a strength, basically like a SWOT analysis. This is a strength, this is a weakness, this is an opportunity, this is a threat. How do we mitigate the threats by leveraging the opportunities? How do we use the strengths to, look at the weaknesses, but then how do the weaknesses also affect our ability to actually achieve or capitalize on these opportunities? I hope
Wow.
that is as simple as break.
Right. I mean, it sounds hella interesting. I mean, like 10 questions just popped in my head. Here's some of them. What about, do you consider possible risk of war between Venezuela and Guyana and Trinidad being pulled in as a sort of scenario?
Yes, I mean, definitely. When we look at trends, we look at the political, the social, the cultural, the economic trends. And so that kind of falls within the realm of economic and political. And so we always do consider, okay, what are the existing tensions within this specific country or within this specific region? But when we look at, what that tension is, we have to understand what is the thing that underscores that tension, because that is what we need to focus on. So, for example, um, you know, if that if there are two countries and they have like a ideological like difference in ideology, so one country might lean one way, another country might lean the other way, and so that creates tension or conflict between them. Most people will try to focus on the actual tension that exists between those countries as opposed to looking at the root, which would be the differences in ideology and how it feeds or creates conflict. So what we do is we look at that, that underpinning issue and we map out possible scenarios for it. So, okay, if we talk about, we have liberalism and we have conservatism, two different schools of thought and viewpoints. When we look at the trends currently, we see that the world is heading in a specific direction. And as a result of the world going in that direction, we have, a bit more social unrest, we have more uprisings, we have a change in the balance of power when you look at the countries that are now um, gearing up so to change the world order or to replace, something that's been there since I've been born. And so we try to look at that, and we are very realistic. It's not like we're trying to shy away and be like, okay, so if the world is leaning in this direction, how do we, prepare this specific country or the specific group of people to navigate that type of environment? If the world is leaning in this direction, are there any opportunities in the world? Because we tend to look at things only from a bad mindset or things are horrible, as opposed to what are the opportunities that we can leverage as a country or as a people. So yeah.
Are you also considering the impact of AI on Trinidad and stuff. I mean, that's such a popular topic right now that I'm talking about infinitum.
Mhm.
And, what does the futures say about that?
Well, right now, we AI has just, kind of sprung onto the scene almost overnight. It's like one of those things where it was a flip of a switch. Of course, that is understanding the context that AI had existed for some time before, but it's accelerated at a scale that you don't see most things accelerate at. So we've one of the trends that we've noted is, well, when you look at the developed versus the developing world, even though those are terms I don't personally agree with, but when you look at developed versus developing world, you see that AI advancement tends to be very heavily concentrated in the developed world, and so the developing world lacks infrastructure to even bridge the digital divide, which is the first step of even embracing or getting to a place of being receptive to AI. So those are the trends that we focus on. We focus on, like, this growing. You've always had a gap between developed and developing in terms of technology, but now AI creates this opportunity for that gap to broaden
And
drastically.
and even
Um,
like to solidify in some ways as a threat, huh?
and it has a lot of development implications, because now what we're going to see is a lot of economies are now going to go in the direction of technology. And we have some Caribbean countries, and Barbados has signaled that they want to be the hub for technology in the Caribbean, and so they are trying to, aggressively get on board with AI. But you have a lot of the realities. A lot of countries in the Caribbean don't have even the basic infrastructure for internet access. And so if you don't have that, you don't have the foundation, you're not going to be able to capitalize on any sort of development like artificial intelligence. And we're
Yeah.
going to hardly get left behind. I know the Commonwealth is currently trying to mitigate that situation in terms of looking at the balance of power as it relates to who has AI, who does not have AI, creating a hub and a space for people from developing worlds to interface with artificial intelligence and get some you know. But then, of course, another big issue coming out of AI and a trend is that, this is a highly unregulated field or area.
Mhm.
And so a couple months ago, through I do some work with the UNODC, which is the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. And so we are preparing for the 15th Global Crime Congress, which takes place next year. And that is where member states come together to look at issues, that promote criminality, that affect, like, the level of crime in the world. And they make certain recommendations, they adopt a resolution, that sort of thing, usual UN style of meeting. But on the agenda this year is artificial intelligence, because they've
Right.
recognized that AI also is being weaponized, and is now where crime is also going into. So that's another trend that has, significant impacts for the future. So, I mean, yeah, it's
That's a lot already as it is. I mean, tell me, okay, let's apply this a little bit. Well, let me get your insights on something a little bit. If you had to tell me, w- like, apply what are the Trinidad and Tobago context specific futures that you have identified, if you may tell us.
okay. So I could give you one example, which is how we deal with water, right?
Okay.
Uh, so currently, water is solely in the hands of, a state-owned enterprise, which would be the Water and Sewerage Authority. And then there's a private-public partnership with the SALCOT for the desalination of water and the provision of water to WASA, right? So in essence, what you have is a monopoly. Whether you call it state-owned or not, it is a monopoly. You have one entity that controls and solely operates the flow of water in Trinidad and Tobago for use and commercial and personal use. Trends are actually predicting that even in other countries where you have state-owned utilities, that at some point within the next 50 years, there's actually going to be privatization of those utility services, because governments are not going to be able to continue financing them because of where that shift in global economies, and the fact that, when you look at Trinidad and Tobago specifically, we are a oil and gas nation. We are completely dependent. We've made no significant steps towards the diversification of our economy. And so when you look at the trends that have existed in other petrochemical states, it's that same model. It's you have with discovery of oil, the exploitation of oil, and then revenue from oil, all being flooded into the, you know, making everything publicly owned and accessible and subsidized and free for people. And at some point, the oil starts to run out, or something happens politically that affects that country's ability to capitalize on its oil. And so this government actually then has to start privatizing and selling off assets that it owns to be able to deal with its debt. And to just, move away from this dependency relationship that it has with its population. And so that is one of the trends that we see for Trinidad and Tobago, that if we do not continue, and I mean, you already see it happening in real life, we already see it, but that is something that is definitely going to continue to scale if we don't diversify. So the trend that we've identified across petrochemical states is that structure. You discover oil, you capitalize on the oil, you make everything public and available, and then at some point it runs out or it gets restricted and you have a complete, decline. Venezuela serves as a perfect example,
Example.
what would have happened. And that is the reality in other oil producing nations as well. It's not specific to Venezuela, but that is the trend. And
Yeah.
so that sadly is where Trinidad and Tobago is heading. I mean, I gave it within the context of water and other
Yeah.
public utilities, but it applies across the board. Wherever there's significant state ownership or state investment in something, you are going to see a reversal of that. You're going to see privatization, selling out of assets, opening up of the economy to invite and allow more competition. And that is how government is going to, in the future, be
Yeah.
forced to kind of regulate by creating competition, and then hopefully see a active Fair Trade Commission coming into
Right.
play and, regulating that environment to keep prices competitive and low, so that the consumer or the citizen isn't overwhelmed by what is going to be happening. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
I
that,
mean, if you had to say like, okay, so what about some bright spots with regard to your futures predictions? Are
mhm.
there any Trinidad specific bright spots, or is it just all risk and risk mitigation?
It's not just risk and risk mitigation. I mean, we have to look at, what are the opportunities that exist in the current environment, right? So
What are
if we,
those opportunities?
okay, so let's talk about the orange economy or the cultural economy, right? There are a lot of opportunities there. I mean, there's a lot of threats. There are a lot of threats, but there are a lot of opportunities there. And one of the big opportunity areas is if, the government and the carnival industry starts taking intellectual property seriously and starts capitalizing on the use of intellectual property. It is then going to be able to, bring in money because you own the IP of what you are producing and you are capitalizing on the IP. And IP is, a non-tangible asset. It's not something that is going to run out. It's not a, finite thing. So, if we start using our intellectual property more and create an enabling environment where people's, expression is protected, there's an opportunity there for our
Mhm.
economy, so that we don't have people just stealing designs and creating multiple variations of what we offer here. If we protect it,
Yeah.
and Jamaica has taken some steps in that, so there are opportunities for us to learn from Jamaica. So for example, in Jamaica, in their carnival industry, they, even though you have multiple bands and you have multiple players, they all assimilate under one brand for Jamaican carnival that is controlled by the state. And so
Right.
what you have is the government is actually now offering to the international market a brand, not
Mhm.
not one band or another band or come here, go there kind of things. Like, okay, you come to us, we are a brand and we get you what the experience that you want. And so you create a more tourist informed or sensitized carnival experience. And that is more attractive to telling a tourist, just go online yourself and figure it out and then come here.
Right.
Carnival. And the government works more with, like, the hotel sector, with airlines, to kind of like all under that brand of Jamaican Carnival. So if
Right.
we have something here like that in Trinidad and Tobago, that's definitely an opportunity.
Ooh.
I
And
mean,
it sounds
you
like
know,
it's a great opportunity. I never heard the term orange economy until you just said it. So
so
that's interesting.
that is the creative economy. It's a new. well, a fairly new concept that people are looking into. How do we leverage intellectual property, creativity, ideas, and expression into something that is economically beneficial and viable? Um, another example I could give you in terms of trends. And again, whilst we have trends and we understand that we have opportunities, the actions that we take today definitely determine whether or not those opportunities become weaknesses or if they become,
Mhm.
something that is beneficial to us in the future. And
Okay.
so another one is manufacturing. When you look at Trinidad and Tobago's manufacturing sector, it's very alive, it's very active. We produce a lot of things specifically for personal consumption, like snacks, seasonings, drinks. But what is the opportunity that is available to us? Latin America, that market that is so close to home, but is so underserved and underutilized for whatever reason. But that is an opportunity. And if we have a government that is able to say, okay, LATAM is a place to go and get our products into, that creates the opportunity for us to diversify our
Yeah.
economy
Yeah.
and bring revenue in, but also improve trade generally with another region. So it reduces our dependency on, the traditional players in international trade.
Yeah.
And that is what being futures or foresight or forward thinking is about. It's
Yeah.
understanding that we are currently in a position that if America economy crashes or the UK economy crashes or something like that, the implications that it's going to have on Trinidad and Tobago is that people here are quite literally going to starve.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
going to be able to survive. But if we, and so we talk about diversification in terms of product, but we don't talk about diversification in terms of consumer. And I think that that's a big thing as well when you think about the future of where we're heading.
Yeah. I mean, even in Poland, I see some Trinidadian products. I'll tell you what I see. Bitters. So this is in all of the bars, essentially. Bitters is just something that is a very common product that is all over the world. It's in Poland too. I also see there's one pepper sauce which is called Trinidad Scorpion. Even though it's not coming from Trinidad, I believe that it's BP. I could be wrong, that it has licensed the name and uses some Trinidad Scorpion pepper in the product. So I see that also. And then you have some rums that you also see in the market.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond, so that's kind of the manufacturing. We're competitive, right? We're all we here in Poland with regard to that. So, and then, something else that you said there about Latin America. This is something that, like, I've asked multiple guests this question, like, why aren't we all over Latin America? Why aren't we in Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, right? Why? Just why? And I just never get a good answer beyond the inability of Trinidadians to communicate with these people. So we don't speak Spanish, we don't speak Portuguese, and it seems to be the biggest problem.
That is not my take on it. My take on it
I mean,
stems from our history, and it's the fact that we have come out of the shadows of these people. It's kind of like a child that has left home will never truly leave their mother behind. And
right.
that's the mindset that we have here. This was once our colonial master. I mean, you might say that doesn't apply to the US, but the reality is that at some point in time, Britain also controlled the United States, and the Caribbean and US also had a colonial history, maybe not in the traditional sense of the word, but through its manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine and all of those different things. There was definitely American influence coming in a neo-colonist way. So as a result of that, we have a dependency on these countries because we are so historically ingrained in our relationships with them that we do not see beyond that, because that is what we know, that's what we're familiar with, and that is home to
Yeah.
us.
So is it
Um,
is it is it just there are like unseen barriers that are preventing us from sort of building those relationships with Brazil specifically, and
I
let's say
I think
possibly
it's
Venezuela?
we've become so conditioned and socialized into thinking that foreign, and when I say foreign, I mean like American, European is better. That we
Yeah.
tend to look to the north than look to the people who are closest to us.
Yeah.
I don't think a language barrier. I literally think that on some level, people have been conditioned into thinking that this is the only opportunity, this is the only path. And I mean, it has a lot to do with the realities of the global economy. A US dollar is worth a lot more than what you're going to get out from in a Latin American economy country.
Yeah.
But what we don't focus on is the consumer. The
Yeah.
likelihood of persons from Latin America accessing and utilizing Caribbean goods is going to be much higher than when you have to compete with a country like the US, where manufacturing is just insane, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that Latin America doesn't produce, but perhaps what Trinidad and Tobago produces, where there's less of a Caribbean diasporic community, might have a bit more novelty and might
Yeah.
have incentive for people to try and purchase these products, as opposed to where you have diasporic communities where you have like these products available, but they also have to compete with products made back in the US market, made in like other countries, because the US imports from everybody, England imports from everybody. Like when you think about that, um, so I think it has a lot to do with one, history, and two, like psychological conditioning in a unseen way that stems from our own history. I don't believe in the language barrier thing, because we live in a world of translators and interpreters and artificial intelligence that could assist you now.
Yeah.
Opportunities are there. I think another thing is politically, it's a fair. Latin American countries have had periods of, what is the
Instability.
word? Yeah, instability. And so there's that risk as well. Like, if this is not a stable environment, is it wise for us to invest into this environment? But when we look at the global reality, no, is anywhere truly a stable environment? Like, we run the risk anywhere you go to now. Um, I hope that at some point, Caribbean leaders could wake up and come as an organization, not just the government of Trinidad and Tobago, can wake up and say, because I mean, think about the fact that we have CELAC, right? CELAC is literally an economic body that is supposed to work on, like not necessarily integration, but collaboration in trade and economics for the Caribbean and Latin America. How
Yeah.
much do you know about CELAC? How much does anyone know about CELAC?
I
What
mean,
does CELAC
I know
like?
about it
You would know
actually.
about it. Yeah, right. So you would be familiar with what it is, but like how much does CELAC actually achieve,
No, not
right?
much.
Or like what is it actually doing?
Hmm.
It's I mean, but when you think about all of that within the context of even as a region, it's difficult to get Caribbean countries to trade with each other and to abide by the CSME and
Yeah.
those things. It's harder to expect them to then do it with Latin America. Somehow it's easy to do it with the US and the UK and the bigger countries, because I guess there's a certain level of status and prestige that comes with being able to say the United States and United Kingdom are
Yeah.
close trading partners or allies,
But
whatever the
you know
case.
what? You would think that like the possibility of just making money would kind of make all of that moot. Like, why would they care about prestige if you could
Well,
make
you
a ton of
see,
money in Brazil?
you would say that from a it makes sense standpoint.
Okay, I get it. I
I
get it.
think politicians think in terms of what is best for my career,
Okay.
because I am always of the opinion that in Trinidad and Tobago we don't have politicians who are public servants. We have career politicians. We have people
Yeah.
whose this is their job, this is
Mhm.
what they do for a living, and they want to be perceived in this light. And
Yeah.
I
Let's
think that
pivot. Let's
a
pivot
lot.
here for a second. To tell me about your advocacy specifically. So we spoke about the future side. Let me hear about the advocacy a little bit.
Oh,
Like, just let me know, like, what exactly drives your advocacy, right? And the intersection of justice, inclusion, and whatnot.
I mean, I think for me, well, like I said in the beginning of the interview, I'm an attorney by profession.
Right.
And so at a young age, I grew up in a household where my parents got divorced when I was very young. I was like 10 or 11 at the point in time. And my mother was a stay-at-home housewife. And so I saw firsthand how difficult it was for somebody who doesn't have means financially to get access to justice. And so growing up, it was kind of like a personal thing for me in terms of I did not want people like, anybody to kind of be in that position.
Yeah.
So I wanted to become a lawyer with the intention of helping other people. Um, and then as I grew up, um, I mean, I'm part of the LGBTQ plus community, right? Openly so. And growing up in that community in a country where your mere existence is something that one, people shy away from, people don't want to discuss. And it's wrong for you to even be okay with who you are as a person. It made me realize that, like, okay, um, you know, for me, it's personal. I guess that's what I'm trying to say from those two standpoints. And so I I mean, I know it's a cliche to say that you have to be the change you want to see in the world, but I personally firmly believe that, and I think that, I have a responsibility and I have a duty to help other people like me, who to help other people who've been through similar situations like myself. Whether it be that they come from broken homes and that's affected them in some way, or they belong to a community that is marginalized, or that they are told that they don't belong or they shouldn't exist to begin with. And yeah, so I guess for me it's my advocacy. A lot of it is personal.
That's what drives you. And then, of course, you're of the Caribbean, you're Trinidadian. And does
Mhm.
this like Caribbean identity also shape your approach to your human rights work?
Definitely, my human rights work is very Caribbean centered. Um,
Hmm.
and it stems from this thing that I read once, that you take a people who historically have been told that you are less than, you are inferior, you do not belong. And then
Hmm.
one day you just flip a switch and you give them rights. And you expect the people who come from the shadows of slavery and indentureship to not hold on to the rights that they were given in that moment in the same way that it was given to them, as in not being open to those rights growing and expanding and changing to reflect current times, but holding on to the exact thing that was given to them that they were denied for so long. So that's one aspect of it. And then the second aspect is, and something that I work tirelessly on is that need to distinguish Latin America from the Caribbean, because we look at LAC as a region, but we only talk about Latin America. And so when you look at reports about human rights, it's always, the examples are always Latin American countries. The documents produced are always fixated or focused on Latin America, but the findings apply to the Caribbean. And so what you've had is that you have human rights issues in the Caribbean where the perpetrators of those human rights violations enjoy a certain level of impunity because nobody's looking over here to see what is happening. So
Right.
for me, it's also very important to, one, distinguish the Caribbean from Latin America, in terms of a region that needs to be looked at in its own right, and that needs to be assessed in its own right.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, so here's a question I have for you, right? So if you commit a crime against humanity in the Caribbean, why should the death penalty not be applied?
Well, the death penalty as the narrative of the death penalty as a form of punishment comes from a place of where we are fixated on retributive justice as opposed to restorative justice, right? Um, and so, I mean, I know you asked me, it's in the context of something that's like definitive, like you commit an act against humanity, right?
Right. Like
Uh,
here's one, right? Trafficking, of people, right, from Latin America. We know that happens in Trinidad, right? Where we got a lot of Venezuelan women and children, also Colombian, that are trafficked to Trinidad and then sent off to these other countries. Should the death penalty not apply to such people?
So there are two things that one apply to the use of the death penalty. In countries that are adamant on retaining the death penalty, the stance internationally is that it should be, the use of the death penalty should be reserved for the worst of the worst circumstances, right? Whether that qualifies into worst of the worst circumstances then becomes a subjective yardstick as to, okay, is this the worst of the worst? Is this not the worst of the worst? There are certain acts that have been deemed to be considered the worst of the worst, right? Um, I don't personally think that people look at the use of the death penalty as a deterrent, right? We have to
Like
start with that.
preventative, like a
Prevent.
preventative method.
We have the death penalty, so people will not engage in human trafficking. So if you engage in human trafficking and you get caught and we execute you, that's going to deter more people from doing it. But when you actually look at countries that utilize the death penalty, again, coming back to data and trends, those countries that have the death penalty on its books have more instances and higher rates of violent crime. You say
Mm.
no, you disagree with that statement.
Of course. I mean, we were talking about having a Eurocentric kind of view of analysis, and I would say it hasn't worked in the West. But when you look at East Asia, when you look at Japan, when you look at South Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, you look at the Arab Gulf states and their application of the death penalty for things like drug trafficking, for murder, you look at their crime rates and it's
But
significantly lower. You look at also the drug trafficking, it's significantly lower. You look at like violent crime in these countries, it's significantly lower. And then when you take those same nationals from these countries and you put them into the Western context, they misbehave a lot,
right,
right?
so
So
that's what
there's
I'm gonna ask you. Do you think it's because of what the deterrent is, or do you think it's because of the society that people are in?
I would
Um,
say that I'd say that it would be both, right? There's definitely a deterrence, a fear of going to these jails, whether it's in Thailand or Malaysia or Saudi Arabia or Japan for that matter, or South Korea. This is another kind of discussion. A lot of people kind of talk about, oh, the war against drugs was a total failure. It was a total failure in the States. It was a total failure in Europe.
yeah, the Western world.
But it was not a failure when you look in the context of East Asia and you look in the context of the rich Arab states. They succeeded, right? Um, like even smoking weed is a massive there's a massive social stigma attached to that in the context of East Asian developed countries. So it worked in that context. However, it hasn't worked in the Western world and that context there. And I think like it's necessary to ask ourselves, okay, why? Why does nation building work in Japan and Germany and it didn't work in Afghanistan and Iraq, right? Like why, you know,
So, I mean, the question is asked in the context of the death penalty, right? I think,
right,
yes, I mean, I know that there are lots in the, what do we call them, the Eastern country, Eastern world, whatever you want to call it.
right. Developed
They
Eastern world.
they tend to have very strict laws, right? And those strict laws don't only just have, like, some offenses don't have the death penalty, but they carry very long prison sentences. They carry very like long they have hefty fines. um and then you also exist in a society where you are socialized and conditioned into operating and behaving a different a certain way, right? And you made the point about you take those people out of that society and you put them into other countries, and then for some reason they misbehave. And I think again that goes to the fact of you are a product of the people that you socialize with. So if
Yes,
you culturally have a society that respects the rule of law, that respects authority, yes, you have the threat of a penalty there, but is it that what they are afraid of, or is it that there's a collective good that they all subscribe to because collectively they share a certain vision or they share a certain mindset? I mean, look at it within the context of Japan and littering, right?
yeah,
Like they,
this makes
they,
sense.
they just clean up wherever they are because they have that collectivist approach that this is my country, this country belongs to me, it needs to be clean, and I benefit from it being clean. It's the
Right.
same thing, like, certain decisions in Tokyo. They've started actually engaging in intergenerational dialogue to address issues that exist between generations and
Yeah.
getting people again adopt a collectivist approach to dealing with situations, right?
Yeah.
I
I mean,
I
one country that I kind of want to spotlight when we're talking about cleanliness and crime, I think a good spotlight is Rwanda, right? With under Paul Kagame. Rwanda is a very, very, very clean country. And so you ask yourself, and safe. And you ask yourself, how did Kagame do that, right? Whereas all of the surrounding countries are quite the opposite. Crime-ridden, war-torn, dirty. And then in Rwanda, he was able to build clean and crime-free society. And what he did was through punitive and extremely harsh measures, including
guess the discipline, this like holding a big stick over people. But In a lot
Yeah.
of countries, I mean, anybody like we talked about in the Western world, you can hold a big stick over people, and it really isn't going to,
Yeah.
deter people from doing anything.
Yeah.
But with it, I personally am of the opinion. This is just
Yeah.
my personal
No, no,
opinion.
no, no, just challenging you a little bit here.
The death penalty is something that I think
Hmm.
has been debated time and time again, but we always you have to consider it like this: when is too far? Like if you allow a country to have this ability where you commit a crime and the state could take your life,
Hmm.
what then stops the same state from saying the death penalty could apply to this most minor of crimes, right? And so you create an opportunity for authoritarian regimes to rise and to
Hmm.
say, okay, well, we don't, the rule of law is not about justice. The rule of law is about retribution. And so if you violate the law in this country, we're going to kill you, right?
Right.
And that is one, giving people way too much power that has the opportunity to be abused and misused. Two, when you look at data from certain countries, there are a lot of people who've been executed, and then years later, information comes to light or new evidence comes to light that this person did not, in fact, commit the crime that they were accused of. Or you have people who get sentenced to death because they had inefficient counsel, because most people who commit those types of crimes often don't have the means
Yeah.
to afford a proper lawyer to represent them. And so, because of improper representation, they get convicted, not because there was sufficient proof that they
Right.
committed the crime that they are accused of. And so, I think it's one of those, for me, it's one of those penalties that has too much room for error
Yeah.
and too much room for abuse and misuse. Um, and I think, I mean, you have to look at it, my perspective is like life. Life is that's the one penalty that when you carry it out, there's no reverse. It's
Yeah.
a reversible form of, and I will say it is torture, because a lot of countries, when you look at how they carry out the death penalty as well, it is in a very, very archaic manner of, judicial hanging
Hmm.
in the 21st century. Like, I mean, even if you want to make the argument that the death penalty should be retained in some countries, again, that's where the school of thought comes in. Restrict it to the worst of the worst crimes, right?
Hmm.
Need to have proper oversight bodies to make sure that it's not being abused, that persons have the right to appeal a first instance conviction. It shouldn't be that you just get convicted and then you get executed, because what if the court that found you guilty is wrong, right?
Yeah.
Or approach your case in a wrong way.
Yeah.
And then apart from that, like, how it's, if you are adamant on retaining it, and this is something that abolitionists often advocate and lobby for. People think that if you are an abolitionist, all you care about is removing the death penalty. We understand and we accept that there are countries that are never going to get rid of the death penalty. What we want to do is restrict the use, or confine the use of the death penalty to specific things, and look at the way in which that penalty is carried out. Okay, one, the person has to be able to exhaust appeals available to them. Two, you cannot prolong because then in many countries there's like this prolonging phase of, you get convicted, you're going to sit on death row, you never know when it's going to be a last day, if today is the day you're going to be executed. And so in there comes a level of psychological torture that goes beyond, punishing the person for the crime that they committed. Like, there are just so many different factors that come into it. But I mean, you took it back to, you started the question by asking about human trafficking, right? Whether or not, again and again, I think that comes down to, is this a worst of the worst crime? Like I said, me personally, I don't think the death penalty should be used. I think that, as long as we focus on retributive forms of justice, as opposed to focusing on restorative justice and trying to understand why people have done what they have done, and, try to understand criminality from a social standpoint, and trying to, okay, address those gaps in society, as opposed to, hey, okay, you commit the crime, we get rid of you. Like, to me, that doesn't solve the actual root issue.
Yeah. Oof. I mean, it's definitely a complicated like topic.
Mhm.
For me, it's complicated, a complicated topic. But let's go a little lighter here, right? Let's talk about, you mentioned that you're part of the LGBTQIA plus community. How do you navigate this advocacy for rights in a region with, with strong cultural and religious resistance? And also, while you're answering that, why do you use the term LGBTQIA plus and not just, the LGB or LGBT or gay or whatever that may be?
Right. So the first thing is LGBTQIA plus refers to a community of people who actually all face very similar forms of discrimination. And so it is a community, it is a group of people that, the basis on which they are discriminated against has, similar underpinnings to it. It's whether it be on from a gendered standpoint or a sexual orientation standpoint, but all fall within the concepts of, sex and gender, right? And I think that for me, it is important to include the QIA plus to it because queer people, intersex people, asexual people always get excluded from the narrative. And people forget that, these communities, as small as they might be, or these groups of people, they do exist. And so they deserve recognition, they deserve rights, they deserve advocacy. So it's for me, it's just a sense of belonging and understanding that, like, I look at myself as being double marginalized, right? In the sense that one, I'm gay, and then well, maybe I should say triple. One, I'm gay, two, I'm brown, three, I'm from the Caribbean. That's like three different levels of, like, looking at me as being different. And I talk about it in, on a regional standpoint and an international standpoint, which is where the coming from the Caribbean part fits in, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean, I'm familiar with the intersectionality hierarchy and whatnot. So yeah, I get it.
right. So was the first answer. The second, which I think was the first question.
Yeah.
In terms of navigating it, I have to firstly start by acknowledging that I've been pretty privileged in the sense that and I do sadly think it has a lot to do with, like, the way people perceive me in terms of, because I'm one, educated, two, I'm a lawyer, three, I have, even though I'm brown, I have a certain skin complexion, and those things confer certain privileges onto me.
Right. I
Um,
mean, but privileges that you worked for, right?
well, not the skin color part, but
But
I mean, yes, education, yes, but you also still have to come from an environment that is, an enabling environment where you could actually, like, you have supportive parents. I mean, I was lucky to grow up in a country where we have gate, for example. Like, I mean, I would maintain if gate did not exist, I would not be where I
yeah,
am today.
me neither.
Um, but in terms of navigating that space, I've been privileged. And I think a lot of it has to do with, being educated. I think one, there are two things. One, from the time you go into a room and you say, I'm an attorney, there's some level of respect that people confer to you for whatever reason. That's
Mhm.
another conversation for another day.
I mean, if I want to say for me personally, I think one of the biggest problems in Trinidadian politics is the colonization of the political space by lawyers and attorneys. But we can really have that conversation on
Yeah,
that
that's
time.
a conversation for another day.
Right.
But that's like one aspect of it. And then,
You talk about also the religious resistance side
right,
of
so
it.
the
Like,
just resistance side of it. I honestly, again, have not had, like, I see, of course, I see comments on social media. Of course, I read the things that people would say, and I see the statements that come from the IRO and other
yeah,
religious interest groups. And my perspective on it is, I think that there's a very big knowledge gap.
hmm,
One, two, there's always this narrative that people like to use, whether they are religious or not, that they don't have a problem with people having rights, but nobody should be able to force their lifestyle on other people, which to me is the biggest irony.
hmm,
Because in a secular country,
hmm,
what purports itself to be a secular country,
yeah,
religious people have far too much influence. And religion, people's right to practice their religion is their right, but that doesn't mean that you should be able to control or
yeah,
influence or dictate how other people live their lives, right?
yeah.
There's a reality. So it's very ironic, one, to start there. And then two, I'll be completely honest with you. I have shifted my work my advocacy work from a local level to an international level. And I will tell you the reason why is because I've realized that if people are not willing, hey, like, if the change is not going to come, you could have a million and one conversations with the people in government, and the conversation always goes the same way. You then have to understand that your government is your government, but your government is still answerable to certain bodies and certain groups and certain people. And so when you start working with those bodies, those groups, and those people, and what I've found in the work that I've done is that, again, there's the Caribbean so overlooked that when you actually go and you talk about, like, what the reality in the Caribbean is with the UN and different bodies, you realize that they don't have that knowledge. And so when they get access to that knowledge, you see a direct shift in how, UPR would take place at the UN level, or how interactive dialogues between states and the United Nations Human Rights Committee would go.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's a difficult space to navigate. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
very cognizant of the fact that, like, there are some people who have the opinion that people like me shouldn't even be alive. And people in this country share that opinion. They may not be as vocal with it as people in other countries maybe, but there is, of course, that conversation. But
I
it
mean,
is
there
really,
also, you know what I would say also, like, I think there are also people that exist within the LGBTQIA plus community that do not agree with the direction that it is currently going. And there are people also who say that the addition of the other marginalized groups into the acronym or into the
yes.
community has kind of diluted or made difficult the original charge, has been sort of a backdoor for heterosexual people to sort of invade a space that, you know, people built. And I have heard that a lot. Maybe I
Yeah.
share it too a little bit that I think, you know, too much inclusion means dilution. But I mean, I want to also kind of shift a little bit across it to your work with the UN Human Rights Council, because I think that it's sort of linked here with your advocacy. So,
Mm.
how does your work there influence the policy on the ground?
Okay, right. So when I do work with the UN HRC, which would
Yeah,
either be the council or the committee, council being all of the member states of the UN sitting in plenary and going through the UPR process, and committee being in experts appointed to a specific committee that have responsibility for the ICCPR, which
yeah,
is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights,
yeah.
and responding to, and engaging in interactive dialogues with regard to how they've complied with the ICCPR. So two different things, right? I've done work at both levels. I've done work both in person and virtually.
Hmm.
A lot of my work focuses on making written submissions on what is happening on the ground in respective countries, because I am not confined to Trinidad and Tobago. I've been doing reporting across the region,
Yeah.
and in other parts of the world. And in my own reporting process, it's very important to me that those reports are reflective of the actual society that they come from. So I usually reach out to a partner organization or touch base with an organization that works on that mandate in that country. Or I would reach out to somebody who's like, a prominent, well, who's known, as in they're openly a part of that community. If it is a report on SOGI, which is sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, or if it
Yeah.
is a death penalty, I would reach out to perhaps somebody who's been on death row, somebody who's been convicted, or an organization that works on the death penalty, and I ask them to give first-hand information into the
Oh,
reports,
okay.
what life is like on the ground. So this is not a report that is me just putting research from what is online and what is publicly available. It has a lot of first-hand information incorporated into it as well. And so
Yeah.
those reports go to the respective UN body, and they end with recommendations. Now, and this is why I think it's important that people from the region need to also, like, take part in these processes. What I've found is that, so in the context of a UPR, the state comes to talk about its compliance with the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and just all a broad general, like, human rights violations. And so countries make recommendations to that state during its when the spotlight is on that country. And the state has to answer every single recommendation. They either accept a recommendation or they note it. Noting a recommendation is a diplomatic way to say no, we ain't doing that, right?
Yeah.
And so what I found in my own, like, having the knowledge of growing here and being from here is that you can't sit down and watch a country like Trinidad and Tobago and be like, legalize, gay marriage or something like that as a
Why not?
recommendation.
Yeah.
Because we are not ideologically there as yet. You have to get there, there has to be foundational steps. And we haven't even started to lay a foundation of tolerance and acceptance in this country and in other countries. So what I do is when I go and I meet with delegates from countries and I talk with them, my recommendations are things like, okay, the government's narrative is that there's public support or public sentiment. This is what the people want, and we are elected to serve the people. Where does that support come from? Are your people sensitized? Are they educated? Are they informed? Most times the answer is no, right? So your support comes from a place of a lack of knowledge. And so what is my recommendation? Okay, have a public education campaign that is, spearheaded by civil society in collaboration with the government to educate people on the death penalty. Collect data both before and after and present that data. When you make that type of recommendation in a UPR setting, it's very difficult for a country to say no, because what I'm asking you to do is educate your population. I'm not asking you to do anything overly complicated. So you put the country into a position where it's like, oh, well, I can't say no to this. I have to accept this recommendation. And so then that allows, and again, they have to come back every few years and they have to report on how they've operated, like, the recommendations that they've noted, accepted previously, where they've gotten to with that, right? So it allows for like some filter down into, okay, we have to start doing work on this or take some sort of preliminary or ground steps, right?
Yeah.
That's how it translates to a local level. I've also been, using again, I always say I'm very privileged to be able to be in spaces like this.
Not just privileged, I'd say you're not just privileged, you're smart and you've done a lot of hard work.
Well, I would accept that as well. It is a labor of hard work. I've been doing advocacy since I was 14 years old. And so, people always reach out to me and they ask me, and again, very similar to the country mindset, you have to put in foundation work to get to where you want to be as an individual or as a society or a country. So when people reach out to me to say, like, how do you get access to UN opportunities? My response is it's 12 years. It's 12 years worth of work that took me to get,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but what I found is that I cannot be the only person. I do not want to be the face. I do not want to be like, the face of the movement. I don't care whose name is on the movement. What I care about is the movement itself. And so for me, it's very important to bring what I've learned there back to the ground and also start working with civil society organizations here, connecting civil society organizations, or where I work in other international spaces advocating for Caribbean inclusion. So for example, I could say I had the honor to chair, there's a entity called the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, which is a consortium that works on the death penalty made up of over 200 NGOs across the world and bar associations and whatnot. And so they're like one of the experts that the UN, the EU, and those other international governmental agencies would go to for things related to the death penalty. And I had the privilege to be able to chair a branch of it on working on women and gender and interfacing with the death penalty. And, when I got into that space, which is a predominantly European space, it was important for me to say, okay, one, when we talk about Africa, we can't just talk about Africa. We need to look at West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and break up the region and MENA, right? Caribbean and Latin America, no, we can't be looking at them together. We have to distinguish them and look at them separately, right? And so what I did in my year there was introduce regional leads, and regional leads reflected regional realities. It wasn't about what the US or the UN or the UK thinks, how they think we should be grouped. It's about how we are actually grouped geographically, culturally, politically, and socially, right? To be as representative and as reflective as possible. I'm also not a person who believes in top-down decision making. I believe in decision should come from the bottom and inform the top, right? So in that space as well, um, I wanted my regional leads to to be the point of contact with the organizations on the ground in their respective zones. And they have their own meetings, they figure out what their priorities are, what they need. And then when the lead comes to our meeting, it's really about, just telling us what support you need, what you are doing on the ground, how we could best assist you. So that was very important to me. Another thing that was very important to me, and I take this with me wherever I go, is they need to establish communities of practice.
Yeah,
Organizations should have the opportunity to spotlight the work that they're doing, to teach about shortcomings, to teach about best practices, so that knowledge is power. If you want to dismantle the things that divide us, you have to have the knowledge to do it, right? So that is also something that's very important to me, and now that is what I'm trying to apply on the ground. So I work with my work with the UN is through a ECOSOC partner organization in the US, called
yeah,
the Advocacy for Human Rights. They've been doing human rights work for decades. But when I work with them, it's very clear. If we are working on the Caribbean, I am the person who is steering what is happening. I don't want, there's no American person who's going to be steering what is happening. I am the person who's going to find the organizations. I am going to reach out to them. I'm going to hold the preliminary conversations with them, and then we work together to produce something. Um, and so it's also been important for me in that space as well. So, okay, I can't be the only person who goes to the UN and speaks at the UN, because then, or if something happens to me and I am the Caribbean, what happens to the Caribbean?
yeah,
So creating opportunities for other people to go and interface with the UNHRC and UN bodies and mechanisms. Those are the things that are important to me. I
yeah.
think, and I mean, this is me being a little critical. And if this is, if people watch this, I might get criticized for it, but I am one who never shies away from saying what I think,
Yeah.
needs to.
I
And
like
I,
that.
I
And I
think,
like I have respect for that, Like I also like a good, you know.
I think in a lot of activism spaces, activism is about cementing a legacy for yourself. And it's not about cementing a legacy for people like you. And
Yeah,
so everybody wants to be the name, everybody wants to be the face, everybody wants to be the person who, when you Google them, their name is associated with whatever the cause is.
yeah,
There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you are laboring, you are putting in a lot of work. Everybody wants recognition for their work, but it
yeah,
cannot stand end with you. There
yeah,
needs to be some level of, community engagement. And what you find is activists who work on the same cause fight each other, and they don't work together. And so even within the movement, you have, you know, division, and that
yeah,
people don't understand that those are very covert ways in which
mhm,
change can occur. Like those are
yeah,
barriers. And so, like I said, and I will say it, activism is too, tied in with people's ego. And that
yeah.
is a, yeah, I think that
You know something else about activism? Because I feel like I would have labeled myself an activist in my 20s. I'm definitely not one anymore. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think there's a problem in career activism also, I believe. When one makes the activism cause a career, what happens to that activist when his or her goal has been achieved? And what
yes.
you tend to see happen is just a shift in advocacy, and that not necessarily be a positive movement, for instance. I've seen people advocate for, let's say, gay rights, and then shift their advocacy towards Catalonian independence. And it's quite a jump to do these kind of things, but it was hot at a particular time. But secession and division seems to contradict the cause of inclusion, but it was just this, okay, no, we're activists, we're doing these things. But anyway, I don't want to go too much into that. What an interesting conversation. I have two more questions for you. This one, and I think it leads into the conversation here. What gives you hope that, the systems in our region and Trinidad and Tobago can become more inclusive and future ready?
What gives me hope is my generation, and that is my honest answer. I
Are
think
you a
that
Gen Z or no?
I'm a Gen Z.
Are you Gen Z?
I am.
Okay.
I
Okay.
think,
Mhm.
you know, I am a Gen Z person who would recognize that I did not get here by myself. The generation that came before me had to do a
Mhm.
lot. And again, comes the foundation thing. Millennials laid a foundation that, millennials crawled so that Gen Zs could walk, so to speak, right?
Right.
Um, and I think my generation gets a lot of flack. People think that we are too sensitive, we are too lazy, we are too this, we are too focused on like living and not focusing enough on working. But I think it comes from there's a shift, and our generation recognizes that there's the shift in priorities. One, but then there's also a creation of boundaries. And I think that people from my generation excel when it comes to enforcing boundaries, standing up for what they believe in, not being afraid to challenge the status quo. And this is not specific to Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, you see it across the world. So as
Yeah.
people tend to label the Gen Z like what group as lazy, I think Gen Zs are some of the most active activists that you would see, and they engage in several forms of activism. It's not just the
Yeah.
loud and outstanding in the road type of activism, but when you look at how Gen Zs use social media to promote activist messages and causes, and the just the way that they've been able to advocate for issues and advocate for themselves is commendable, and that is what gives me hope. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not that every Gen Z is doing this. And again, I think it comes down to a lot of who you socialize with. A lot of my friends, I mean, I'll be honest, I am in a group chat with some of my friends who are very like-minded. We all work in different things. Some work in policy, international policy, some work in economics, some work in psychology and psychiatry and like those different things. But we're in a group chat called Cabinet, which started as a joke because when
Right.
yeah, joke. It was when we were younger, we all wanted or had political aspirations.
Yeah.
So we all made this pact that, like,
That's so cute. I love
into
that.
politics, this is the person who's going to be the AG, this is the person who's going to be, right?
Yeah.
Um, what started as like a thing, it function, we function like an actual cabinet. Something happens in the country, somebody sends a message, we discuss it, we break it down, we pick it apart. We look at how it applies to us and the work that we do and what can we do as individuals and collectively as a group, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so again, I think it has a lot to do with who you socialize with. There are lots of young Gen Z people who are taking charge, leading initiatives. But that again, that segues into another conversation about like, if
Yeah.
whether Trinidad has an enabling environment for activism or not. And for
I would
instance,
say not, so obviously not.
which I would say no, there's a lot of gatekeeping that takes place in local and regional activism. And again, it goes back to career activism versus actually being,
Yeah.
caring more about the cause than advancing oneself, right?
But
I
it
mean,
becomes, you know what I would say? It becomes like that.
yeah.
We start off like you.
No,
And
but
then
let me
you get into your 30s and you get into your 40s and it becomes, boy, it changes people, boy. Like I have seen that with my own social circles and how we evolve differently. Now especially it's almost like we were so close to each other ideologically, and then there were certain moments that happened that just caused us to go in these massive different directions, almost 180 degrees apart. And then there's bitterness that comes with it. And it's so, I think that's the career activism is a problem, boy. Not
I mean
saying
let me
politics is a problem, but the career activism outside of, other kind of say like passions and pursuits and whatnot.
And I just want to be honest. I mean, I just want to be honest about something and talk about something in terms of like, I'm criticizing career activism, but
Yeah.
not describe myself as a career activist. But some people might say, okay, but if I look at the things you post on social media, a lot of it has to do with like, bringing attention to yourself, right? And the reality is, one, you have to bring attention to the work that you do. That I will be honest, like
Hmm.
that is how I've been able to access a lot of the opportunities that I've been able to access because of that visibility, right? The difference is that I am using those opportunities to build other people up and not just build
Yeah.
myself. And the second thing is like, I post the thing about the things that I do because I want other like gay men who grew up in the Caribbean to be able to see that there's somebody who is being who's able to access spaces, who's able to meet with certain people. And so change the narrative from you can't do anything to you can be the change you want to see the world again, going back to
I want
that
to stop
cliche.
it. I mean, I know, but I'm gonna stop you here, and I'll tell you, like, because there's a contradiction. You
Mhm.
talk about acknowledging your privilege, and then I keep pushing back and saying, no, you did hard work. I'm telling you, like, don't be ashamed of the hard work that you're doing. It's as simple as that. Like, why apologize for it by putting the disclaimer of I recognize my privilege? No, you, Khaleem Ali, have done a lot of hard flipping work. And you got to a certain point because of it. And there's something that works. And I think there's just nothing really to kind of like forget that shame. Don't declare your privilege. You worked hard. And I've one more question for you, right? I think it's a great way to sort of end the podcast. So I was reading in your biography that
Mhm.
one of the many, 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 many things that you do, that you've even created a card game called Consensus and what is that word? Idem? Idem. So Consensus and Idem. Tell me about that a little bit.
So consensus at idem, or consensus for short, it's a Latin phrase in law that means meeting of the minds. And
Mhm.
so card game is a dialogue tool that is meant to use game simulation theory to bring people together to discuss issues that normally divide us, right? This was a project. Last year, I took part in the UNAOC, which is United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, Young Peace Builders program. And a part of that program was that everybody had to create a project that would center around UNAOC's pillars, which would be migration, media, education, women, and religion, right? Because the UNAOC really is like the peacekeeping arm of the UN, if you want to call it that. Their primary focus is peace building, right? Through non-violent means, through dialogue and critical discussion and conversation. So I worked with Connect and Keep Hope Alive, which are two, related. They are like a brother and sister organization thing happening in Trinidad and Tobago with Micah Jordan, sorry, and Kristen Camacho. And they use cards to have conversations, like deep conversations, and help people who are introverted, get into a space where they could socialize and break the ice and talk about things that actually matter and make friends. And so I kind of like, I've been to a few of those events, even though I'm an extrovert. Um, One of my best friends is an introvert. And so she asked me to go with her and I went it.
Yeah.
And, I really saw potential in using that kind of model for my own project. And so I worked with them to develop consensus, which is like, you come to, and we did do actual simulation of this, and we do plan to do more iterations of it.
Yeah.
You bring people together from all different walks of life. They've never met each other. They sit at a random table based on a number that they've been assigned to. And you have moderators walking around, and there are cards and rounds, and each round has a different card. So you ever, Cranium, the game?
Yes, I'm familiar with
Right.
it.
You know how they have like action cards, conversation cards, da, 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 da. We've incorporated that in as well. So for example, it's meant to promote teamwork, and it's meant to force people to work together on a shared vision or a shared goal on a divisive topic. So it might be, for example, a war breaks out in a country. You are the person that owns a media house. You are in a meeting with like the people from your team about how you are going to report on the story, brainstorm, and then actually pitch what the final campaign is going to be. And every group works on that card. And then when what you see is like you actually have like a press pool. So you come up and the other people are going to question you about like, okay, why did you take this route? And so what we have is actually people having conversations, and you get exposed to how people's social conditioning actually influences the work that they do and what they produce. But we've also found that because it brings people from different walks of life together, it forces them to consider realities that they would never otherwise be exposed to. So I will always remember there was this one specific thing where they had to discuss like, ongoing challenges or something like that. And things that were important to you. And they were on this table, like older women and then like Gen Zs. And they were talking, and the Gen Z's priorities are be able to get a loan to buy a house.
Right.
right? The older people were like, oh, that would never be a priority. They would never think that that's a priority or that's something that, because they've passed that phase. And so they cannot, so when they started having conversations with the young people at the table about how difficult it is for them to get a mortgage, how difficult it is for them to, even get a job to secure them a mortgage, that is not like a 1 month contract or a 6 month contract, whatever the case may be. It allowed for some intergenerational dialogue and intergenerational understanding. I mean, that's just two examples. But the cards, they discuss religion, they discuss, like I said, religion, media, education, women, migration. One of the cards, for example, forces you to put yourselves into the shoes of a refugee. Like
Okay.
you have 12 minutes to flee the room that you are in. What items are you grabbing? Why are you grabbing those items? Right. And then you have a conversation about that.
Right.
Um, and it's really meant to force you to step into vulnerable people's positions. And so it's supposed to promote consensus at them, a meeting of the minds where you have
Mm.
your differences, I have my differences, but when we work together, we could find some sort of commonality. And so, yeah, that is what the game focuses on.
Well, that sounds great, and I will play it soon, I suspect.
Yes, I will be bringing it with me when I come to Poland.
All right, great. Okay, so Kaleem, it was a pleasure, and I think this taping was honestly, I had a great time. So, that's it.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to, seeing the other iterations of the podcast as well. And hear what other people have to say.
No problem.